I feel really excited to be here at this panel, especially because a number of our panelists have sort of traveled distance to come see us, and so it's extra exciting to have them here in Brooklyn. I'm going to do just a really brief introduction, and then the panelists will read from their work briefly, and then we'll go from there, just so we have a sort of sense of things. Here on the far left is Christian Kracht, who is a prize-winning Swiss novelist whose books have been translated into 27 languages, thankfully one of them English. And he's going to be reading from his novel Imperium, which I'll describe for you a little bit as we move into the questions, but he may set it up a bit himself. And André Alexis is here visiting us from Toronto, born in Trinidad, also a prize-winning author. He's going to be reading to us from 15 Dogs. And Naja Aidt, who is here from Brooklyn with us, but also from Copenhagen, and is also a prize-winning writer. That's all we have at this panel. A Danish poet, short story writer, and also now she's going to read to us from her first novel, Rock, Paper, Scissors. So, Christian, would you mind starting the readings? Short, 3 to 5 minutes. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to. Hello. I'll just be reading briefly from my... Is this... Can you hear me? Sorry. No. Okay. Well, yes. Hello. My book is... it's called Imperium. It's set in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century in what is now Papua New Guinea, and at the time, very briefly, was part of the German Empire, German New Guinea, and it is about a young German man who traveled, who was a vegetarian and a nudist, and he traveled to the colonies, the German colonies, to start a cult there, but based on the exclusive eating of coconuts, which was his idea to no longer be a vegetarian, but to be a cocovore. And this is a real-life figure, and he ate only coconuts for 16 years, and he got very slender, and many diseases appeared. And so I'm just going to read a bit from the middle. The fellow's name is August Engelhardt. During his stay on his island, Engelhardt had not only lost several pounds, but had also grown wiry and muscular. His skin was now rich dark brown, and his hair and beard, which he slathered with coconut oil every morning, had become bright blonde and golden from sun and salt. Pursuant to his instructions, the oil his employees squeezed on Cabacon, which is the island he lives on, was bottled in half-liter flasks on the mainland and given an appealing label designed by the Hebetshöhe postmaster, which showed Engelhardt's somewhat touched-up, bearded profile. The oil refining process Engelhardt paid for out of pocket, or rather on credit from Queen Emma, who is still more or less smiling inscrutably, a somewhat doubled advance payment. One day that Cabacon coconut oil, which already lay stacked in the Forsyth trading post packed in dozens of wooden crates, would surely find a buyer. To this end, Engelhardt had established several very promising contacts in Australia, notwithstanding the fact that the letters he dispatched to Darwin, Cairns, and Sydney, as befell mailed advertisements all over the world, were briefly skimmed then stacked, cut down the middle, and reused as a coarse toilet paper. His letters in particular were employed in the staff privy of the accountant's office at a copper and bauxite mine not far from Cairns. The writings that told of the therapeutic, thoroughly beneficial, and diverse possible applications of his Cabocon coconut oil in Engelhardt's quite literary but somewhat awkward English served the visitors to that Australian toilet only to a limited extent as entertaining reading while they did their business, as they had been perforated, cut, and separated at precisely those areas that would have enabled an unhindered read in complete sentences. Reassembled and reread with the hundreds of similar mailed advertisements, they no longer made any sense, of course. Thus his letters wandered, scanned fleetingly, bereft of meaning, wadded up and smeared with filth. They landed in a seepage pit on that gigantic, almost uninhabited continent to the south, which Engelhardt once visited with friendly intentions during the time remaining for him in the Protectorate, but whose soldierly and coarse, mostly drunken inhabitants so disgusted him that after only a week and a half he boarded a mail steamer to return to New Guinea. The humiliating ends that befell his brochures remained concealed from Engelhardt. Had he found out, he would scarcely have decamped for Cairns, nor was he able to anticipate anything of the great calamity later to be dubbed the First World War. So it was only a premonition that afflicted him as he sauntered through the alleys of that Queensland gold mining town. Is there more time, or is that it?
We probably should move on, even though...
Yes. Thank you.
I'm happy to...
Okay, can you hear me? One evening in Toronto, the gods Apollo and Hermes were at the Wheat Sheaf Tavern. Apollo had allowed his beard to grow until it reached his clavicle. Hermes, more fastidious, was clean-shaven, but his clothes were distinctly terrestrial. Black jeans, a black leather jacket, a blue shirt. They had been drinking, but it wasn't the alcohol that intoxicated them. It was the worship their presence elicited. The Wheat Sheaf felt like a temple, and the gods were gratified. In the men's washroom, Apollo allowed parts of himself to be touched by an older man in a business suit. This pleasure, more intense than any the man had known or would ever know again, cost him 8 years of his life. While at the tavern, the gods began a desultory conversation about the nature of humanity. For amusement, they spoke ancient Greek, and Apollo argued that as creatures go, humans were neither better nor worse than any other, neither better nor worse than fleas or elephants, say. Humans, said Apollo, have no special merit, though they think themselves superior. Hermes took the opposing view, arguing that for one thing, the human way of creating and using symbols is more interesting than, say, the complex dancing done by bees. But human languages are too vague, said Apollo. That may be, said Hermes, but it makes humans more amusing. Just listen to these people. You'd swear they understood each other, though not one of them has any idea what their words actually mean to another. How can you resist such farce? I didn't say they weren't amusing, answered Apollo, but frogs and flies are amusing too. Well, if you're going to compare humans to flies, we'll get nowhere, and you know it. In perfect, though divinely accented English, that is, in an English that every patron in the tavern heard in his or her own accent, Apollo said, "Who'll pay for our drinks?" "I will," said a poor student. "Please let me." Apollo put his hand on the young man's shoulder. "My brother and I are grateful," he said. "We've had 5 Sleemans each, so you'll not know hunger or want for 10 years. The student knelt to kiss Apollo's hand, and when the god had gone, discovered hundreds of dollars in his pockets. In fact, for as long as he had the pants he was wearing that evening, he had more money in his pockets than he could spend, and it was 10 years to the instant before their corduroy rotted to irrecoverable shreds. Outside the tavern, the gods walked west along King Street. "I wonder," said Hermes, "what it would be like if animals had human intelligence." "I wonder if they'd be as unhappy as humans," Apollo answered. "Well, some humans are unhappy, others aren't. Their intelligence is a difficult gift." "I'll wager a year's servitude," said Apollo, "that animals, any animal you choose, would be even more unhappy than humans are if they had human intelligence." "An Earth year? I'll take that bet," said Hermes, "but on condition that If at the end of its life even one of the creatures is happy, I win. But that's a matter of chance, said Apollo. The best lives sometimes end badly, and the worst sometimes end well. True, said Hermes, but you can't know what a life has been until it's over. Are we speaking of happy beings or happy lives? No, never mind. Either way, I accept your terms. Human intelligence is not a gift. It's an occasionally useful plague. What animals do you choose? As it happens, the gods were not far from a veterinary clinic at Shaw. Entering the place unseen and imperceptible, they found dogs mostly, pets left overnight by their owners for one reason or another. So, dogs it was. Shall I leave them their memories? Asked Apollo. Yes, said Hermes. And with that, the god of light granted human intelligence to the 15 dogs who were in the kennel at the back of the clinic.
And I'm reading from my novel Rock, Paper, Scissors, and I'm reading from the beginning where we meet the main character Thomas, and he is in a restaurant with his sister Jenny. And she says, "Remember when Dad brought us here the night of the accident after you'd been to the emergency room? We sat over there." Jenny points at a table next to the window. "I think it must have been this same waiter, back when he was young. You were pale as a sheet. How old were we?" "I was 11, you were 9, yes. And we got to order whatever we wanted. All I ate was chocolate cake, 3 slices. She laughed suddenly and loudly. "Ha! You were pale as a sheet, though nothing had happened. Nothing serious. Bumps and bruises, just a few bumps and bruises." The waiter sets steaming plates before them. The bartender places a red drink, a pallid stalk of celery poking out of it, in the middle of the table, as if it were meant to be shared. "Just a few bumps and bruises," Thomas repeats slowly, pushing the drink toward Jenny. "That's one way to look at it. Oh, don't be so dramatic. Eat your food. Cheers." She raises her Bloody Mary so that the lamplight shines through the red liquid. "Ha! Just a few bumps and bruises." "That actually looks like blood," he says, pointing at the glass with his fork. Then he pours into his oxtail and showers the sauce with his knife. The waiter limps back carrying a half-empty bottle of red wine along with a plate of olives. But Jenny isn't happy. "They aren't anything like the ones we had last time. Plain, tasteless. I bet they got them at the local supermarket. Try them yourself. Everything gets worse over time. Everything, doesn't it?" Thomas refuses to try the tasteless olives. He takes a swig of wine and says, "Dear Jenny, you're always complaining. Everything doesn't get worse over time. Everything gets better. We're rid of Dad, for one thing. Think about that. And he'll never come back, except in our most terrifying nightmares. How can you be so mean? You've always been mean. It's a constant, neither worse nor better with time. But everything else gets worse. Love and marriage. Our bodies fall apart. Hideous. Things get uglier. Doors, buildings, chairs, cars. And silverware," she pokes her fork at him. "Yup, even silverware gets uglier and uglier, and people get uglier and uglier. Just think of Helena and Kristen's twins, how they dress so tastelessly you wonder if it's a joke. They sent a photograph at Christmas. Kristen must have taken it. She's such a terrible photographer." And she stops abruptly, sets down her fork, and smoothes her shirt sleeves. Then she looks directly into his eyes. "You're also getting uglier. You really are. You were handsome once. You look like Mom and her brothers." "Can we talk about something a little more uplifting?" Thomas smiles at Jenny, but she shakes her head and says, "I don't know. I'm not doing so well. You think we can save a few odds and ends from Dad's apartment before it's cleaned out?" "There's nothing there, Jenny. Just a few ugly, ugly things." He smiles again, and now she too smiles despite herself. Her teeth are yellow, her mouth white and red, a sudden gleam in her green eyes. "I want the toaster. It's special to me." "Then take it. No one will know. What do you want with an old toaster?" "Come to think of it, did he have anything personal in his cell?" Thomas lights another cigarette and shakes his head. The bartender's playing some strange music, a kind of languid disco. A notebook and a stack of porn mags, his watch. What was in the notebook? Nothing. Doodles and some phone numbers. He didn't even have a photo of us. Don't be childish, Jenny. Of course he didn't have a photo of us.
Thank you all for those readings. You know, I was thinking something that struck me about all three of your books is that each has a kind of tight constraint under which it's operating, and which gives it a sort of energy, which sort of pressurizes the book. Christian's book is literally sort of set on an island and also based somewhat on a real historical figure, which kind of constrains where you can go with it and also gives it energy. And André's book is, besides the section he read, mostly written from the point of view of dogs, sometimes in a special dog-like language. And your book, Naja, also has a sort of tight constraint of kind of the death. It's sort of its engine is the death of a kind of charismatic and powerful father figure, and then also a kind of a sort of a find in the toaster that kind of determines a lot of what. And I was curious, sort of almost from a craft perspective, when you're putting these things together, how having those constraints aided you, made it more difficult, what it sort of did for you as a writer, as a sort of working writer, when you're in the process of putting it together.
Do you want to do it in order?
Any order. I think you're purple. I think purple goes first.
That would make me Prince.
Yeah.
For me, it was very lovely to have, I used a device. One of the dogs reads poetry, or creates poetry, and a friend of mine named Terry Matthews, who's my favorite American writer, told me about a new Lepian thing, which is called A Poem for a Dog, where, I'm sorry to take this long, François Caradec, a member of the Oulipo, invented a form of poetry which could be understandable to humans and to animals. And in François Caradec's poem for a dog, if you read it aloud, you will hear the name of a dog spoken. And so in every poem that was, of the 15 that was written in this novel, a name of one of the dogs had to be audible if you read the poem aloud. And what it did, and what it always does for me when I have structural constraints or when I have obligations, which is another way of talking about it, is that I get to think about those obligations, and it frees my psyche to do whatever nasty work it wants to do with the rest of the book, because I'm constantly trying to think through these things and where to put them and how to deal with them. So it ends up for me making a novel a little bit like a sonnet. It has a kind of rhythm and structure to it because of those things, and I love having to have my mind occupied by those things rather than, say, the thematics or the imagery and whatnot, because those come naturally anyway, they're inside of you. So it can be tremendously liberating to have obligations and constraints.
Well, I have more than 20 books to my work, but mostly poetry and short fiction. So this is my first novel. So for me, I think the worst struggle was turning myself into a novelist. So I kept writing. The first part of the book I would write constantly for a long, long time, and I was always about to give up and call it a short story. But the toaster thing was kind of my fuel in a way. So it's such a silly thing. I mean, the main character, Thomas, finds something in this toaster, and he is completely sure that it will change his life to the better, but it does the complete opposite. What was difficult for me and lovely and playful, it's a book with many characters and a lot is going on. It's complex. So it was very interesting for me as a short story writer to unfold the story in a different way and to stick to the present sense. It's written in present sense, and that means that it's like I felt I was on a motorcycle or something, because it moves fast so quickly, and and the reader will constantly be in the exact now, which is kind of, it's a stressful way to write in a way, but it's also very intense, and I really enjoyed that. So, but the toaster was always a thing that would keep me going.
Well, we were talking, André and I were talking about this earlier about the translation, and I think, well, German somehow doesn't really sometimes translate very well into English. It works the other way around, and so I'm just so very grateful to my translator who did a wonderful job, because some of these sentences in this book, at least, they're 1 or 2 pages long, and in German.
Your translator is Daniel Bowles.
Daniel Bowles, and so if you read this in German, you tend to forget that the verb goes at the end, and it's, so English doesn't really work that way. You don't have these run-on things, and so this made me, just very, very happy that he was able to, transpond this into English, these sentences that, meander on for pages without it sounding, well, it does sound contrived. It's supposed to sound contrived, but he got the tone very nicely. So, I was speaking with André earlier that I think translators who have to create their own, they have to write the thing anew. It's not just, they don't translate it, but they have to create their own poetology. The thing, they just have to, write it again. They're not, and they're paid nothing for this, which is really a scandal, I think. And they work for a year on something, and yeah.
They get at least $700, I'm sure. No, but I read the book in English. I wasn't able to read it in German, but I feel like he really caught this with these sort of long forms, this kind of almost absurd, exhaustive, rigorous situation. And I was interested that Naja used the word silly when she talked about discovering the toaster as a kind of way to keep momentum in the book and contain things. And all of the books have an element of almost the sort of, silly is not necessarily always the right word, but something kind of comic or absurd, either through being outsized, like a kind of strangely outsized belief in coconuts, or silly because there's a kind of natural absurd structure to dogs speaking or to bets between a god. And I'm kind of curious to what extent you guys felt that was helping you in the writing, or something that naturally came out, or what was the place of the kind of either absurd or inconsequential as a kind of form of absurd, sort of the surprise, the small humor. Because maybe André, yeah.
For me, the beginning was very clear. I was writing an apologue. An apologue is the Greek term for a narrative that has some sort of moral message to it. The hardest part for me was figuring out what a moral message might be, because we live in a time where morality is extremely difficult to express. Sorry.
Yeah.
Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So I was writing a thing called an apologue, which is the Greek word for a fable or a story that has a moral message to it. I said my difficulty was with the idea of morality. It's incredibly difficult to bring a narrative down to one moral at the end of it for 21st century writers. We're more and more aware of the complexity of other moralities, other wares, and so that was the hardest part. But one of the nice things about the absurdity of writing an apologue was allowing myself to go into a place where I thought people would have ideas about, well, what animals are like, what gods are like, what humans are like, and to screw around with that, to try to make it so that, in fact, it's not about dogs, it's about humans. and that we see ourselves through the intermediaries that are dogs. The dogs are absolutely human, and their behavior is, well, because they've been given human consciousness, very human, but we get to experience it differently because it's through dogs. And so it was a constant revelation for me of thinking, well, it's kind of interesting that humans are heterosexuals and dogs are not. What would it be like if heterosexuality was in fact an abomination? Because if you're pansexual, heterosexuality is weird. And so that's just one of the ways of just thinking through basic fundamental human things. So for me, it was incredibly enjoyable because it starts from zero and you get to build up and understand, not understand, but come to an approach of what it is to be human while making dogs act in a human way.
And it sounds like it surprised you, like the book came up with things that you didn't have plans for. It's also in the way you describe that sort of it's helpful to have your eye on structure so that the other things sort of come without your eye on it, or?
Yeah, the biggest surprise, okay, so it's because I'm an idiot, I didn't realize this, but of course in our lives, dogs are how we learn about death for a lot of us. They're the first creatures and beings that we have in our lives that die, and their deaths is overwhelming to us. Certainly my dog's deaths were overwhelming to me, and I hadn't thought what it would be like to have to write 15 dying dogs, which was horrible. So having to kill off 15 dogs was not a fun project. But in doing that, yes, I was surprised because of the rawness and the intensity of the emotion that was still there for creatures that I loved and I had forgotten, but this was a way to get back to them. So again, in a way, it's the surprise of the emotions allows me to deal with the other things like the morality, like the gods, like other characteristics, thinking that they do. Is that right? Is that okay?
And Christian, when you were sort of I imagine at some point you either already knew about or were researching more about the life of August Engelhardt. When you were writing the book, was the book surprising you? Was he amusing you? How is it? I think whenever you're engaging with something just very straightforwardly real, like just sort of the real matter of real life, how did that sort of affect the way you were writing it? Because he's an amusing figure and a tragedy.
Well, yeah. I came across, years ago, a postcard that it was a sepia-tinted photograph of him standing underneath a palm tree with this sort of proto-hippie beard and long hair and a loincloth, and he looked very modern, and then I felt I really wanted to get to know this person, and then of course embroider, well, yes, I suppose it is a. You were mentioning that earlier. I think the word is playful or ludic. Well, one must be careful not to, sort of try to satirize too much, because it lends itself to that. Coconuts are sort of intrinsically funny, and naked people are too for some
and
reason.
And nudism is intrinsically funny.
I don't know why, but it is. And so you have to sort of stop. You don't want to go there too much, because then it just becomes this, as you say, silly, I think. I think that was what Naja was. The word was the word. Sorry, the word. It was silly. Okay.
It was silly, but silly in a positive
Yeah,
way
yeah.
as well, right? Yeah.
Good silly.
Good, not bad silly. Okay.
Well, so as I said, my novel is about male identity. I moved to the States 7 years ago, and I realized that you really have issues with gender here that we don't have in Scandinavia. For instance, women are not paid the same amount of money for their work, and so on, no childcare and all of that. So it's a completely different society. So I thought I wanted to to write about gender, and I thought it would be interesting to not write about the female side of it, but about male identity. So I went back to the Greek mythology to look up all the big male things, all the traumas, the brother relation, the father relation, the male friendship, the homophobia, all of that, the relationship to women, to family, and so on. And I kind of took my main character, Thomas, through all this, poor soul. So it is, so it is, yes, and it is a tale about morality as well, because he does something that he should not have done, and the book is about the consequences of that, and you can say the male crisis that he suddenly finds himself in, and that he doesn't really realize that he's in. But the toaster thing is actually a true story, because I have a friend who has a friend, and this friend is from Wales in England. And at some point, his father was put in jail, and the father was in the 70s, and they cleaned out, the friend and his siblings cleaned out the father's apartment, and they found this old toaster, and it was completely filled with drugs, you know. And I heard this story many years ago and kind of forgot about it, but suddenly when I was writing this novel, it came back to me, and I was like, no way, I'm not going to do this. This is too, silly. But it was like, I couldn't resist it, and I just felt this toaster is going to be in this novel, and it's going to be this little old filthy toaster that's going to, force Thomas into a horrible journey.
Well, and I think the constraints work so well because, in a sense, each of the books is sort of, they're all slim, which is one thing. They've in a sense, they sort of have a kind of speed and velocity to them, even though they're kind of touching on kind of very heavy substantive things, just to sort of short order it, whether it might be history or ethics, or and so it seems natural that they sort of found kind of some sort of small constraints or light constraints on them. I was always also curious to hear you guys talk about how, like, for example, Naya's story is so much, it's kind of a family that's not functioning and not staying together, and yet that seems to be the constraints of the book as well. Like, did you find that that was developing as you were working on the story, and you kept running up against this? Were you discovering what the novel was about as you were writing it, or in your mind that was always your preoccupation, your set of interests?
Because it was my first novel, I really didn't know how to do it. But what I realized was that I was halfway through the novel. I had to find out how it should end. And that was kind of a new experience for me, because if you do a short story, you don't necessarily need to know that. You can just go with the flow and then see what happens. And I think I work that way mostly because I do so much poetry. So that is like, I work on intuition a lot, and the force of the language, you could say, like the way I construct my sentences, the rhythm of the language, the light and the darkness, and what's heavy and what's light, and all of that. But no, what was the question? I forgot. Say it again.
I always find the answers are more interesting than the question. I wanted to ask André, I once was told that Marlene Dietrich apparently would never agree to be in a scene with a dog, because the dog's always more charismatic, more interesting, more compelling. And I was kind of, I was curious when you sort of, at some point you must have had the idea and realized that you were going to go with it, and what were the things you were sort of avoiding doing? Like, what were the sort of kind of show-stopping? What was the? Because you said you wanted it to be surprising, that there would be things about, we all know dogs, but it would be things about dogs we hadn't thought about, or.
Okay, for me, I guess I'm the worst representative for my work, because My work starts from very intellectual things a lot of times, and in this case it did as well. There is a tremendous essay by a wonderful critic whose name is Viktor Shklovsky. He is a Russian formalist, and the essay is the first in a book called The Theory of Prose. The essay is called Art as Design. And what he did was he's one of the first to speak of the alienation device, or the Entfremdungseffekt, where the value of poetry is that for us, when we live in the world, a lot of things disappear for us. When you're in a room or a house where a couch is over there, the flowers are over there, you start to lose the ability to see the couch and the flowers. And poetry, what it does is it restores the couch and the flower to you by putting those things in an unusual state or situation. So poetry makes the real live again. He, in Art and Device, spoke of Tolstoy in a long short story called Strider, which is about a horse and given from a horse's perspective. And he spoke of the ways in which Tolstoy alienated the reader and allowed the reader to re-experience the world from the horse's perspective, giving normal things as if they were happening for the first time, describing normal things as if they were unusual, and so forth. I didn't like Strider. I adore Tolstoy. He's a huge influence for me, and I think he's a magnificent writer. But I didn't like that particular story because it felt to me like he was constantly trying to get the horse to comment on things that it wouldn't make sense for the horse to care about. And so I was always aware that Tolstoy was forcing this horse to think about things. And what I wanted to do was
beating the horse
he was
too
beating
much.
he was beating the dead horse. But what I wanted to do was to make sure that logically, insofar as it's possible for me as a non-dog, to create a situation that other humans would agree was dog-like, and not forcing the dogs to be dog-like. So I funnily enough, I thought a lot about a Japanese director, Yasujiro Ozu, who's constantly filming things from down low. You're constantly looking up at the characters, looking up at the scene. Fascinating, and also naturally from a dog's perspective. And actually there's a scene, sorry I'm going on, there's a scene from Tokyo Story. Tokyo Story, I had a character, a dog, watch in my novel. So there's a dog watching Tokyo Story. And I thought what was going to happen was that the dog would talk about how few dogs there are in Tokyo Story. In fact, there are 2 instances of dogs in Tokyo Story. One, which takes about 3 seconds, is 4 dogs. You hear a whistle, and 4 dogs run across the screen. That's done. Towards the end of the film, you see a guy whistle for 4 dogs, and then you don't see the dogs. So the whistle, and then the dogs, and then the guy whistling, but no dogs. And for me, again, it was like in Tokyo Story itself, there was this kind of oddly canine moment, canine mysterious moment. And that's actually kind of what I wanted in the novel, just a very dog-based kind of perspective. Sorry.
So you have a dog describing from the tatami position.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes. Yes.
Because his vision is lower.
Is low.
Yeah.
I really was about tatami mats, but you thought it was about dogs. So no, sorry.
Exactly.
Well, Christian, do you feel like I kind of think by taking a kind of somewhat a real moment, a historical figure, a historical moment, that's its own form of alienation. Like history becomes fresh again. I mean, did you feel? And there are also a lot of, for lack of a better word, sort of cameos. Like people we're going to recognize, and events we're going to recognize in Imperium. And it's just like a delicious thing to play with. How did you decide to handle those things? Because they also, you know, the cameo always sort of, it's a very energized moment.
Well, there was nothing known about Engelhardt before. He didn't have a Wikipedia thing, and very hard to find out anything about him. And then I discovered there was there was a thesis written on him in Auckland, New Zealand, and so I traveled to Auckland to speak to this student, and somehow it really wasn't enough. I mean, he was just, you know, he needed to. Sorry.
How did the student come to have enough kind of material to build a nonfiction document about this?
Well,
Not much.
I don't. I didn't ask him that actually. No, no. He had actually, you know, gone up to New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, and tried to see if there was anything left of the very brief colonial period, which lasted, I think, about 25 or 30 years. It was German New Guinea was the Australians came and turned it into their own colony until 1975, and there's basically nothing left of that time. There are no churches, no German, you know, Lutheran churches or anything, because of, you know, the First World War. Of course, the Second World War was much more destructive in that area of the world, and the Japanese and the Americans. I've gotten sidetracked. Sorry. What was the
I was
question?
just kind of curious when you had sort of moments that you knew your readers are going to realize sort of historical figures or events, that how you sort of handled that sort of, that's powerful. Because I think the cameo effect is sort of like the dog effect. It's immediately enlivening and powerful.
Oh, okay. Well, yes. I mean, well, I wanted these people to show up. So if Kafka makes a small appearance, and Thomas Mann, and then in the scene where Thomas Mann appears, he's not named, but the text itself turns very Mannish,
Man-like.
and you know, meanders and over pages of one sentence, and I guess that's just a ludic element that I'd never done before, but I'm going to do it again. I don't. I think there's a name for it. Historiographic metafiction, I think it's called, wisely enough. And yeah, one just has these people popping up, and I did enjoy writing that. And also to hide people also in the text, which one does not recognize immediately. Yeah, there's a sense of I don't know if it does make you as happy as dogs do, but certainly, well, yes, I suppose. Dogs make me very happy too. They're
Kafka makes me
wonderful.
happy. So.
Oh. Dogs in Kafka.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to open it up to any questions from the audience. Or if the panelists have any questions for one another. No. I did think there was a sort of, I thought it was interesting to think about the unities among the different books, and that in the end, it's sort of one of those funny things, you know, you're at these festivals and things are coming together, and in the end, the sort of unity that seems most important ends up being kind of just a sort of intelligence, because each of the books has this thing where it could easily sort of be another book that you could have written much faster.
What if I ask you a question?
Um,
Have you read David Shields?
no.
Do you
I've
know
read the opening of
Reality
that book.
Hunger?
I've read the opening of Reality Hunger.
It's a book that really bugs me, and I know it's a New Yorker book. It's a book from a guy who's from New York, is it not? It's something that I keep constantly on my mind as a thing that bothers me, because I feel that, and it's in the writing of this one, I felt like
I mean, the overall argument.
the argument
of the book
that
bothers you.
you know, the real is what we're after, and that we love seeing bits of the real in fiction as sort of a way to revitalize fiction. I feel like fiction is, it's not an escape from reality, but it's the promise that reality is constantly to be remade, and it can't be real. When you go to fiction, it is so that reality can be less real, not more real. And so in some ways, this kind of going away from the real was incredibly important to me and has been important to me through the writing of the last few novels that I have. I feel like reality can go knit, as far as I'm concerned as a writer of fiction, and I have real trouble with the notion that what we're trying to do is to give you hand mirrors so that you can look at yourself and see yourselves better through the agency of fiction.
Well,
So being in New York, I'd like to rant a little.
We receive your rants and dissent, and I'm kind of curious what Naja, your thoughts on that would be, because I do think it's interesting, both in Rock, Paper, Scissors and in Baboon, I feel that you're drawn to and kind of really expert at people, in a sense, in an extreme position. They're not sort of the person I'm sitting next to on the subway. They're under, in one way or another, the situation is extreme, and if you feel your motivation or the way you're drawn to that might be something similar or not to the way Andre's sort of drawn to something that you might describe offhandedly as surreal, although that's not quite the right word, or Christian's drawn to sort of another distant, far moment in history and location.
Well, I think that, talking of reality, fiction and reality, that the reality itself is so absurd in many ways, and I think that goes for my fiction as well, that I need to, or I like to, or I'm drawn to those moments in life where suddenly you find yourself in a very weird or difficult or completely absurd situation. I was raised in Greenland, and it's a place where, very extreme. We have like long winters with no light at all, and then the summers where there's like 24 hours of daylight. So maybe that is part of, my body in a way, so that I'm drawn to explore those situations. But I come from a very privileged place in the world. I mean, Scandinavia, with all its money and racism and all of that. I think that when you're so spoiled as we are in Scandinavia, people are not able almost anymore to deal with difficulties in life. And that is definitely a subject, especially for Baboon. Baboon is a short story collection that criticizes, I think, the Northern Europe and the white spoiled person in Scandinavia, but also it tells a story about what happens if you do not feel you have a responsibility to interact with society and your community anymore, because it's all taken care of, as long as nobody from the outside enters your perfect world.
I wanted to thank Christian and André and Naja for being with us.
Can I ask you guys a question? I'd like to ask you a question, since I'm also in New York. What is this Donald Trump business with you people? Is that a true thing, or what is it? Just getting the news from Canada, it feels very odd that a person that I know is a television entertainer is being taken. I guess Reagan was an actor, but this guy seems a little bit more out there. Is there a possibility that he'll be actually the Republican nominee?
I think we have to make room in the room for the next panel, but this is a great discussion for the hallway.